much. Eylon Levy is a former Israeli government spokesperson. Hello, Eylon.
Good evening.
Good evening. Look, we're hearing from aid agencies who say that their teams have gone from handing out aid to needing aid themselves. What is going on? How come we see so many starving civilians, and who's responsible? And is it over now in terms of, at least is it going to progress, that more people are going to survive hunger and starvation?
Unfortunately, we've seen a complete breakdown of the UN distribution systems inside Gaza. Right now, there are 500 trucks, the contents of 500 trucks, sitting on the Gazan side of Kerem Shalom, and Israel is urging UN agencies to pick them up and deliver them. Israeli authorities have offered them 5 routes. They've offered multiple options to get that aid, and the UN hasn't been able to shift it. That's why Israel today has announced several interim measures, including the resumption of airdrops, to try to address the UN's really indefensible failure to distribute aid inside Gaza.
So you are seriously suggesting that the United Nations would have the aid that close, would go through all that's needed, these aid agencies, to have it that close and don't want to distribute it? Is that right?
Clearly they are failing, whatever the reason. We know the demands that they're making of the Israeli authorities. Well, they're demanding, for example, Hamas police protection. Israel has offered its own military escorts. The UN is demanding Hamas police protection because they regard Hamas as the de facto authorities. That is, of course, unconscionable and completely impossible as far as Israel is concerned. But it's important to take a step back and understand that this is, without a doubt, the most complex humanitarian challenge on planet Earth right now. Because nowhere else on Earth are UN agencies expected to deliver aid inside an active war zone where civilians are prevented from leaving. In every other war zone in the world, civilians, it is recognized, they have a right of asylum and they are able to get out of those war zones. Here, the UN is expected to deliver aid into active war zones where Hamas is still fighting, still shooting. In fact, it shot a mortar just the other day at one of the humanitarian distribution points. And that means that Israel is having to work with the UN to try to find creative solutions to get aid to the people who need it. And this is critical, making sure that Hamas cannot steal it.
And yet here we have now the Israeli government with this new initiative. So if they can do it now, why haven't they been doing it before now?
Israel focused until now on trying to get the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to be able to deliver aid into Gaza. And numbers-wise, it is simply the most successful humanitarian distribution operation in Gaza right now. They've shifted nearly, I think the latest figures were over 94 million meals, more than 1 million of them today, trying to get aid directly to the people who need it. Israel was trying to bypass the UN system because of the way that Hamas was able to divert it in many cases, and more importantly, tax that aid, because of course Hamas remains in power in Gaza. Its power is collapsing, but it is still able to intercept those aid shipments. And that's why it's important that UN work with Israel to get aid to the people who need it, while making sure that Hamas cannot steal it to continue financing its war machine and prolonging this war even further.
So the aid agencies, the likes of Mercy Corps, who say there is nowhere in Gaza which is safe for their aid workers. Do you believe that to be true? Or are they making it up too?
No, of course, Gaza is not safe because it's a war zone. Gaza is a war zone because on October 7th, 2023, its government declared war, is fighting that war from a network of tunnels underneath the civilian infrastructure, refuses to surrender, and refuses even a temporary ceasefire, which everyone in Israel was hoping we would be able to achieve. Gaza is an active war zone where civilians are being prevented from leaving, and that makes this a monstrously complicated humanitarian challenge. And that's why Israel is working together with UN agencies, offering them 5 separate routes, offering IDF escorts for the aid, now offering to do humanitarian...
Not according to the UN. The United Nations say the Israeli military has not provided enough secure routes to send the trucks in. And they're accusing Israel of destroying Gaza while blocking critical aid.
From what I understand from conversations with officials, Israel has offered the UN multiple routes. The problem is that the routes that Israel is offering are the routes where there is no fighting. And naturally, the routes where there is no fighting is where there are civilians, and therefore where there will be looting if the UN continues to refuse Israeli protection. This is, again, part of the complex challenge of getting aid inside an active war zone where we know terrorists are trying to get their hands on it in order to be able to tax it and finance their war machine. And I really think it's unconscionable and indefensible that to cover up this failure to pick up a backlog of 500 trucks, earlier this week, Kerem Shalom had reached saturation point. There was nowhere else to drop off aid. In order to cover up that failure, the UN is engaging in a blame game, pointing fingers at Israel, instead of trying to work with it to find creative solutions to get aid to the people who need it and make sure that it cannot get to Hamas.
100 aid organisations seem to differ from what you're saying. Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, Save the Children, all household name charities known throughout the world. They've signed a joint statement warning of mass starvation in Gaza. And they're saying, as I've mentioned earlier, even aid workers are now joining the same food lines. They're risking being shot just to feed their families, they say.
The fact that these are household names, the halo effect doesn't work. It doesn't mean that what they are saying is right. The fact is that right now, Israel has facilitated more aid into Gaza than UN agencies are able to distribute. If they cannot distribute it, they should work better with organizations like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has been able to distribute 94 million meals to the people who need it. The challenge is to make sure that aid reaches civilians who need it, while making sure that Hamas, whose regime is crumbling, who is refusing a ceasefire, cannot get its hands on that aid in order to continue propping up its regime. The tragedy is, of course, the only way to improve the humanitarian situation is a ceasefire and ultimately the removal of the Hamas regime. But Hamas is refusing a ceasefire. Hamas is doubling its demands, no doubt, because it sees the pressure on Israel. It's now demanding that Israel release terrorists who took part in the October 7th massacre. It's refusing a ceasefire because it wants to be able to remain in power after this war. And the E3, for example, has been perfectly clear. The disarmament of Hamas is imperative, they said this morning. Hamas must have no role in the future of Gaza. But that is exactly what Hamas is trying to achieve by engineering this humanitarian crisis. Instead of enabling a ceasefire that will see those poor hostages who are being starved in the dungeons of Gaza released, that will see a temporary ceasefire to pause the fighting, to allow aid in, and to allow talks on Hamas's removal from power, which I think is now a point of consensus in the international community, that this war cannot end with the regime that started this war continuing to govern Gaza.
Eylon, what does it do to the credibility of the Israeli administration when their forces have forcibly displaced nearly 2 million exhausted Palestinians, with the most recent mass displacement order issued on 20th of July, confining Palestinians to less than 12% of Gaza? What does that say about the intent of the Israeli government and how much they actually care about civilians?
It says that Israel has got
Palestinians displaced.
It says that Israel has gone further than any military in the world to try to evacuate civilians from terrorist strongholds where their regime is trying to use them as human shields. Stephen, do you understand the urban battlefield in Gaza? Hamas built 400 miles, that's longer than the London Underground, of military tunnels underneath the whole of Gaza's cityscape. They turned underground Gaza into a military target under people's homes and schools and hospitals and mosques. And they did that to try to gain permanent immunity for their terrorist forces that were firing missiles at Israel and holding on to hostages. So Israel had two options. No, Stephen, because I want to explain Israel. I want to explain why Israel is asking people to move. Either you attack while people are still embedded within the terrorist infrastructure, and even more people are going to be killed, or you urge people to leave Hamas strongholds so that terrorists cannot continue to hide among them. It's why at the beginning of the war, Israel designated the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, and then Hamas moved in together with the population and started firing rockets at Israeli cities from inside the humanitarian zone. If the international community is saying, Stephen, if the international community is saying that civilians must be protected, they cannot be protected if terrorists are fighting from tunnels underneath their feet. They must be moved to places where terrorists are not operating.
I've been covering this story for quite a long time. You will be aware of the reports of civilians being told to go to so-called safe zones only for those safe zones to then be attacked by your country?
Stephen,
you know that was people fleeing for their lives, and you know that when they trusted the Israelis that they should move to a safe zone, that safe zone was a zone that was then targeted. And the Israelis will say, well, Hamas embedded themselves in that safe zone. So is there anywhere safe for Palestinian men, women and children who have no beef with your country to survive?
Stephen,
is there anywhere they can survive?
I remember as early as December 2023 when Israel designated a humanitarian zone and then Hamas started using it to fire rockets at Israel. The fact is, nowhere is safe in Gaza as long as the Hamas regime... Why are you telling
people to flee there then?
Because at the time there were no Hamas forces there and Hamas forces moved together with civilians. Nowhere in Gaza can be safe as long as the Hamas regime is using it as a launch pad for attacks against Israel and civilians are not allowed to leave. Safety will come, Stephen, I'm trying to answer your question. Safety will come when there is a ceasefire that sees this terrorist regime removed from power. And it is a crying shame that Hamas is refusing even a temporary ceasefire, that it feels emboldened now to reject mediation efforts for a ceasefire. But no, Stephen, it's a war zone. And of course, in a war zone,
Eylon, if what you're saying is true, look, I understand war. I come from Northern Ireland, all right? I understand how it works. But you will also understand a fair question is that if you continually justify how civilians might get caught up as some type of collateral damage is essentially what you're saying, and that a civilian, just because they're Palestinian, can never be safe because of Hamas, are you not playing in to the hands of that organisation which is being designated by the UK as a terrorist organisation? If your country cannot distinguish between targeting Hamas and innocent babies getting obliterated by Israeli bombs, you're growing Hamas, are you not? You're empowering them, you're strengthening them. More people will join that organisation. Is that not a lesson from other places in the world?
Stephen, I believe that asylum is a human right. I think that individuals have a right not to live in a war zone and to flee terrorist oppression. And I think it is outrageous that Gaza is the only war zone in the world where civilians are being told they must remain in Hamas strongholds and they cannot leave. But if those are the terms of the battle that Hamas has dictated by building those tunnels under Gaza, then the best Israel can do is to try to operate in the rules of international law to target those terrorists and mitigate damage to civilians.
So you're seriously telling me with the might of the Israeli army, they are allowing Hamas to dictate what is acceptable, what the terms of war are, and that your country has no responsibility for the starving men, women and children who have no beef with your country and are not terrorists and have all they're trying to do is live. You're telling me your country has no responsibility, even if Hamas are anywhere close to them?
No,
it's
Stephen,
okay. These scenes that we're seeing, these scenes that we are now seeing on television, that reporters from the BBC and others are bringing to us, of skeletal human beings because food can't get to them, and where I'm hearing from surgeons who are telling me of amputations because your bombs, your country's bombs, your country's weapons are blowing up children. Do you not have a responsibility for that not to happen?
You're putting a lot of words in my mouth. Israel is trying now to prevent the next October 7th massacre by a terrorist regime that has vowed that it will do it again and again until all Israelis are dead. And we are fighting this war in a battlefield that Hamas carefully designed over 16 years to build a network of military tunnels longer than the tube underneath people's homes and hospitals. That is the battlefield. And it is a battlefield where civilians are not allowed to leave. And when Israel urges them to move out of Hamas strongholds, it is repeatedly condemned for trying to see to their safety instead of being praised for doing the responsible thing, which is trying to get civilians out of a battle zone. The only way we can ensure genuine stability is if this war ends. But for that war to end, Hamas must agree to a ceasefire. Hamas must agree to allow this war to end because it takes two to tango. And people are right to be upset by the scenes that we are seeing on our screens, despite Israel's best efforts to address the most complicated humanitarian challenge in the world right now. But in order to get this to end, the Hamas regime that started this war has to agree to a ceasefire, has to release the hostages it had no excuse for taking on October 7th and is abusing in the tunnels under Gaza, and must agree to relinquish power in Gaza so it cannot continue to turn Gaza into a battlefield for more attacks against Israel again.
Someone's asking here, why am I giving you a platform? Well, you know, we're trying to give many different breadths of opinion a place to speak about this, is what I would say back to that person that's just texted. For those who describe what your country is doing as genocide, and for those who will defend your country as an apologist for genocide, what do you say to them?
Israel is trying to prevent an act of genocide by the Hamas regime. On October 7th, people forget how this war began. Hamas sent in an army of thousands of trained jihadis to murder as many people as they could, as brutally as they could, in pursuit of a jihadi vision of the annihilation of the state of Israel. And they took over 250 hostages. This is a war. This is a war that Israel did not start, a war that Israel did not want, a war that Israel did not expect, but a war that Israel is fighting in order to prevent a jihadi regime from invading again and burning Israelis alive in their homes. It is a war that has gone on for far too long, a war in which people have been killed because their government built 400 miles of military tunnels underneath their homes and schools and hospitals and moved together with civilians every time Israelis tried to keep them to safety. And if people seriously care about the people of Gaza, they should be working together with Israel to make sure the terrorist regime that brought this destruction on Gaza is removed from power, so they can turn a new leaf and start a new future of peace.
Eylon, some of those people who you're asking to join in your appeal to bring Hamas down, some of those people will be Palestinians. And I just want to paint this picture one more time. So your country looks at a possible bombing site. And when all of that military might that you have and the intelligence that the Israelis have one of the best intelligence machines that recognized throughout the world. And when with that intelligence and the might of your army and all the equipment and the sophistication that you have within your military machine knows and sees a civilian population, whether Hamas is there or not, and the order from your government is fire anyway, drop the bombs anyway. We can see children. We know it's a school. We know it's a hospital. We know that those buildings are vulnerable to your bombs. Shoot and fire and drop anyway. Tell me how people would support your country firing in those situations. Tell me what it must feel like to be the father of someone that sees what your bombs do.
I have no doubt.
Or a mother, or a civilian.
I have no doubt that the situation in Gaza is horrific. War is horrific. It's why Israel did not start this war and why Hamas must not be left free to start another war again. But the rules of international law, and it pains me to say this, but we don't live in a perfect world, the rules of international law do not require zero civilian casualties. The rules of war,
zero civilian casualty.
Rules of war.
This is about your government being responsible for thinking about the implications of dropping bombs, which are killing so many men, women, and children. I'm trying to answer
your question. The rules of war require armies to act in accordance with the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality. Namely, is it necessary to hit a target in order to achieve the military objective, which is bringing down the Hamas regime? Are you distinguishing between civilians and between military targets? Is the attack aimed? Absolutely. Israel's attacks are aimed at military targets. And proportionality. And the principle of proportionality says that the expected advantage from every military strike, I'm sorry if this sounds boring, the expected advantage from every military strike must not be excessive. The collateral damage from each military strike cannot be excessive to the anticipated advantage. The laws of war accept people will get killed in war. And the burden it places on militaries is to try to mitigate that harm, to reduce that harm. And that is why, as you noted so often in this interview, Israel keeps urging civilians to move out of harm's way, away from places where Hamas is trying to operate within them. It's why Israel
You have told me during this interview, Eylon, that nowhere is safe.
Because Hamas
you've conceded that your country tells people to move to safe zones, which you cannot ever guarantee are safe.
And
there's nowhere for these civilians to go, is there?
And you should direct.
I am not outraged. I'm not. But I'm stating fact. You have told me nowhere is safe for these people.
I think civilians should be allowed to leave a war zone. I believe civilians have a right to asylum, which is a basic human right, and they should not be kept prisoners inside a war zone where a jihadi group is trying to use them as human shields. But Stephen, understand the consequence of inaction. That if you say that Israel must back off and leave Hamas free to plot the next October 7th because it is hiding underneath civilians, you are saying that international law grants permanent immunity to terrorists because they violate international law.
I haven't seen.
I've got an unconscionable conclusion.
I've got to leave you soon, just because we've got to go to the news. But I haven't heard too many people say, Eylon, that your country has no right to defend yourself. I haven't heard too many people argue that your country has no right to go after Hamas. I've heard a lot of people question just how much your country cares about a civilian Palestinian population getting bombed and killed. I've heard a lot of people.
I've heard a lot of people question. Because I'm hearing a lot of people saying that Israel hasn't the right to exist at all.
I've heard a lot of people question how much your country actually cares about the mass starvation that we are seeing on the ground.
Was there a question there?
Well, what would you say to that? Do you think it's a fair question?
No, I don't. I believe that Israel is trying to do something almost impossible and unprecedented in the history of military warfare, which is try to target terrorists who are hiding underneath civilians, where it gets condemned every time it urges civilians to move out of terrorist strongholds, and where the international community, bizarrely, unconscionably, unforgivably, insists that those civilians do not have a right to leave that war zone and must remain in areas where terrorists are trying to use them as human shields. Every human casualty, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. And those casualties are happening because the Hamas regime in Gaza is waging a war that it refuses to end and refuses to accept a ceasefire and continues to use innocent Palestinians as human sacrifices. And when you point your ire at Israel rather than the terrorist regime that is fighting this war through systematic, deliberate, conscious violation of international law, you are saying that international law grants protections to terrorists because they violate the rules of international law. That is not how international law works. It's not how the ethics of law work. Israel has a responsibility, a duty, to prevent the threat of the Hamas regime from Gaza while doing its utmost to mitigate harm to civilians. And it's doing that in the most fiendishly difficult battlefield in history, where no army in the history of the world has ever had to deal with the challenges that Israel is facing within that battlefield.
Thank you for giving me so much time tonight, Eylon.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much
Thank
indeed.
You.
And hopefully we'll talk again. Thank you. 0808